There it is. Welcome everyone to our live show for Friday, December 25th, 2015, where we are talking about CGI in anime and whether anime will ever start to use CGI ubiquitously. Whether we'll be seeing CGI everywhere. Bong, bong.
CGI. What's CGI stand for?
Computer graphic animated.
Hey, buddy, where are you, Tiger?
Sorry, everyone.
Tiger?
She's
That is
lost
a
her
problem,
tiger.
Apparently.
Tiger,
That is the
I'll
problem with auto load stuff on YouTube. So we will try to avoid that in future.
when you play back a YouTube to a YouTube,
Yeah, I heard you like YouTube.
how many could we shell within each other?
We put YouTube within your YouTube. So yeah, so computer generated imagery, computer graphics. We certainly see CGI in anime. The question is, will we see CGI in anime the way that Disney has kind of used CGI in its entire production, like The Incredibles and such things? That's the big question.
The Incredibles had sort of a different feel to it. Yeah, the CGI definitely has a different feel.
It sure does.
Yeah,
Yes.
There's something about it. I know they're getting better with textures of surfaces, but that takes a lot of processing, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. And we're certainly seeing more CGI in even TV shows. I mean, Reboot back in the day, but even more recently, shows like Tron Uprising and other animated series like that, the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles recent series, were all CGI. And so we're certainly seeing CGI take over from traditional animation increasingly in America, and certainly from movies. I can't think of a traditionally animated movie released in America besides The Frog Princess in the past few years. So the question then becomes, when will Japan follow suit?
Well, you know, it's interesting that you mentioned that. There are some animes in the US, but yeah, the number of animes not anime, but animations in the US, and just the sheer volume of anime that comes out of Japan.
Oh, gosh.
But percentage-wise, that means that the CGI is very small.
It is.
In comparison to the other animations. And in the US, the percentage of animation that uses CGI is going to be larger then, right?
Very much so. And we should explain. I mean, obviously, in terms of CGI, in anime, you see CGI, Hey Desert Fox, in backgrounds for vehicles, things like that. Special effects are done with computer graphics a lot in anime these days. Fighter jets, cars. So it's certainly spread throughout anime, but the main character animation, it's really, I guess, the character animation we're talking about, that you're going to see, are you going to see characters drawn in CGI as opposed to hand-drawn animation? Gundam's played around with this to some extent, but they've kept the characters hand-drawn, except in a few experimental works here and there.
So with these experiments, do they usually go off well, or does it get the response of, oh, why did they do that? It was going so well.
You know, certainly in Gundam's case, folks have never been really crazy about the CGI anime. So there was Gundam Evolve, which were a series of short films celebrating various moments in Gundam history, and those were usually all CGI, and those were well received, partly because they were going back to lots of older Gundam franchises we hadn't seen in years. But then there was the Gundam CGI OVA, which I'm forgetting now at the moment.
How much of it was CGI? The whole
Gundam Evolve, or Gundam Evolve, I think, was entirely CGI. I don't think they had any hand drawn in Evolve.
Well, now there were some earlier anime that went. Were there earlier anime that went all CGI?
Anime in general? What do you mean?
Was that the first all CGI?
All CGI anime? No. They've been playing around with CGI for years and years. In terms of what's out there, I don't know off the top of my head actually what was the first all CGI anime.
I have a suspicion it might have been Vexel or Appleseed, one of those series.
Possible.
But I don't remember the specifics.
Yeah, yeah.
And little bits of CGI had been used, but I think those may have been some of the earliest full CGI, at least from Japan. I don't know about the US though.
Yeah, when we've been seeing bits and pieces all the way back to, I know Witch Hunter Robin uses CGI for a lot of its backgrounds. And that was back in, I think it's 2000-ish, something along those lines.
That seems to make a lot of sense to have CGI for background, because traditional backgrounds are large in order to accommodate the characters, at least back in the Cell days. And having something that you can have a palette that's huge on a computer, you just move it around as an image.
Exactly. And that's what they did, is that there's a character in a rather spare looking apartment, which is kind of convenient. So just every time they needed a shot, they would just kind of, tilt that camera around, render out that background, and then you had that background. The difficulty, of course, is making the background blend with a hand-drawn character. So making all that work together is tricky. But I mean, there's that question. Yeah, and we certainly have plenty of anime that have CGI spread throughout it, as we mentioned, special effects and Yu-Gi-Oh! And all that kind of stuff. The question is, when are we going to, or are we going to see anime made that's entirely CGI, no hand-drawn elements at all, like the Appleseed movies, the recent Appleseed movies, Vexil, things along those lines. And why hasn't it taken over yet?
Well, it's expensive. It's very expensive. Well, I mean, you have to have a computer. And,
well, and that's the thing. It's not just a computer.
A graphics computer
I mean,
that can render 3D renderings, which require a lot of GPUs, and not just CPUs, but GPUs, graphics processing units. And those cards are very expensive to support. To get it all working and properly functioning together and interacting with other systems. Wow.
Exactly. Yeah. And to that point, it's not just rendering out a scene. You're rendering out an entire animated work. So everything's got to interoperate. You've got to make sure that what you're rendering out, the next piece in the chain can then
all the coloring, all the design, all the sizing, all the depth and perception. Oh my goodness, there's a lot to make sure everything interacts smoothly. And so is that, are we thinking that CGI is still in its formative stages, where anime had gotten to where they'd mastered, at least in the Cell world, their process? And then
I think you're right. I think there's a lot of that to it. I think that they've been making anime the same way for decades and decades. And let's not forget, they've been making way more anime in Japan than any other country has been making hand-on animation for decades. So we have huge amounts of history there. But then also you have CGI, I think, takes so many different pieces, and whenever anything changes has such a big effect on the entire process that it's going to be a lot more expensive, not just to jump into it, it's also going to be more expensive to maintain that. And to keep going.
And as the technology changes, we know Moore's law makes things that you've invested in obsolete within a short period of time. That's something that if you have a system that works, that makes money, you may not be too quick to jump on the bandwagon and sink a lot of money into something that's not going to be useful in the next 10 years or 5 years.
And let's also not forget that anime is done really cheap. Anime has very low budgets. Animators make very little money, so it's going to be very hard for you to underbid, another anime studio when you have all these computers you have to buy and maintain and run, and the software and so forth, compared to somebody else who can just charge half the amount. Who's going to win?
Man still beats machine price wise. At least for the time being.
Well, and we were talking about this before too. The other side of that coin is that everyone in Japan draws. I mean, you see this. If you guys have ever seen when like a voice actor will sign something, or they'll be doodling something, and they'll do this lovely little doodle of a character, because everyone when they were 6 years old were drawing manga characters. So you have that pool of talent to draw on too.
Many years of skill and refinement and expectation.
Exactly. So here's the question. What would it take for CGI to overtake hand-drawn animation in anime? What do you think?
Well, cost of labor in Japan rising. That may have an influence on it. Consumer driving it.
True.
If consumers decide they're going to pay for those and not pay for the others, that would definitely put an interest in the studios to expand in those areas. The technology, I think, as the technology gets better and better, there's potential. But again, there's a lot of growing. I think we're just coming out of the digital primordia.
Well, and I'll throw something else into that too. Anime is a very stylized medium. You know, things like how characters run and move are very specific to how anime has grown over time. And it's very hard for CGI to mimic that. You know, you can be very similar in terms of your movement, but, you know, the kind of squash and stretch that you get in anime where somebody will, you know, leap into the air and then hit the ground in this very specific way. It's very easy to fudge that and draw it to make it look dynamic, even though it's not on model. You can't do that easily in CGI because you have to change the model, which is meant to be a certain skeletal structure and bones to make it easier for you. So, you know, that stylization, I think, is going to be much more expensive in CGI. Getting
vector graphics is something great with 2 dimensions. With 3 dimensions, the complication is so much more, so much more complication. And wow, I think there's got to be a lot of growing, but the potential of it is pretty high, because if they do get to that point, they could start a catalog of characters. This is character with long legs or short legs, or one busted knee. This is how that motion occurs. But the complication of the math and being able to do that.
Well, I mean, I completely agree with you there. I think that, I mean, anime is a very combinatorial medium. You know, let's be honest that very often we'll watch an anime series and we'll suddenly notice a character who looks suspiciously familiar. Like, that's kind of that character from this other show with different colored hair. You know, and, you know, if we had these consistent models everywhere, then suddenly it becomes a lot easier to say, okay, we're just going to take these models, tweak this around, and then we don't have to redesign the character. We don't have to do all that kind of stuff.
They're using the template.
And
customize it for the show.
and that's fine. I mean, you know, we all love the fact that anime is able to sort of churn these things out very quickly, and we're fine with the fact that that kind of looks like Sakura from this other show. So I think that is totally cool. Now, to the question Desert Fox asks in the chat room, do we prefer CGI or hand drawn?
Oh, you know, I like seeing CGI expand, but I still have that weird feeling. What is the term for that? The uncanny
valley.
And it just, there's something about it that just feels kind of weird. Sometimes I can lose myself in the fantasy, and sometimes my attention is drawn to it, and I say, you know, I think about how they did that more so than the story that's going on that they're trying to tell. And that's the part that really, I don't do that as much with hand drawn, unless I'm focusing on how they did it. But is that something just because I'm not as familiar with the one over the other?
Right.
I don't know. I do like old cell anime, but now anime has gone to mostly done on computers, even if it isn't CGI. A lot of it's 2-dimensional,
hand-drawn on computer.
Hand-drawn on computer. So there's always an artist impact on it. To what degree is the machine doing the artwork and the creator? And I think the growing part is those little idiosyncrasies that we'll see in the characters. Because if they do have the library, if they do have the template, then we won't really, I mean, we'll focus on the story more, but at the same time, we won't focus on the artistry of the characters because it's a template.
I think that's one of the things. We have not yet gotten a stable of CGI animators that can create memorable animation on the scale of the hand-drawn animators that we're used to now. So there are those animators that folks will follow, and they'll make AMVs about that animator and how they, you know, drew these certain characters in certain situations. And we're not seeing that in CGI yet. I think it'll happen. But I think it's going to take that for CGI to go somewhere, for folks to say, wow, that animation is something that I want to just kind of play over and over again, and it's a signature style. And I certainly agree with you. And it's tough because like I grew up a lover of 2D animation, of traditional animation. And as CGI came in, it didn't look as good. But then as it's improved, you have to concede that CGI can be done very well. The Incredibles we were talking about earlier. That's a beautiful film. More of that kind of stuff, please. It's hard. Now, Liquidus points out in the chat room that some things are meant to be 2D and some things are meant to be 3D. I think that's very true.
Will we see CGI come into 3D imaging systems like Oculus? Will we see anime maybe venture into that area?
Why not? That's kind of how it has to be done in Oculus. Anything flat in an Oculus very quickly becomes very complicated to render and not look weird. But that is an issue.
A whole new narrative style for anime. If you could interact with your anime, oh my goodness.
Yeah.
That would be a great blend between the 3D world and anime.
That could be very interesting. Yeah.
That sounds like it requires a lot of horsepower though to process.
Oh yeah, it's going to be interesting. But we already have. Let's not forget Idolmaster, the video games, where those are CGI characters who are animated in using cell shaded drawings, and they look like anime characters. They managed to make that look perfect, practically speaking, and that's all done on consoles, so in real time. So that can be done. Now, Jesse James in the chat room asks, have you guys found any anime that has CGI you actually liked so far? Now, two parts to that question. Have we found an anime that contains any CGI that we like? Heck, yeah.
Yes.
Ghost in the Shell Standalone Complex, straight up right there. All the Tachikoma, those are CGI.
Now this is the difference between CGI being used and full CGI.
Right.
So
that
CGI has been used for quite a while,
Mhm.
and of course the backgrounds being one area. And
Yep.
quite often that budget has been a little bit. It's been more expensive to have CGI, so it's used
Mhm.
for special effects or certain types of areas where you want to be able to deal with things.
Mhm.
There's a lot of good CGI out there.
Mhm.
When you go entirely CGI,
Mhm.
then the potential for having really good stuff and mediocre stuff in the same show
Sure.
is there. And so it's a little bit harder to judge that
Mhm.
because, if you subdivide it, you can say that part was great. The
Mhm.
city, how did they do this entire cityscape? It's just mind blowing.
Yeah.
But then some of the characters just don't look like they're human enough.
And we have the same problem in traditional animation, to be honest.
Yeah.
We've all seen anime where there's some shots where you go, oh, ouch, but others that are beautiful.
And some of this is stylistic, like how abstract the show is background wise. Are we seeing polka dots everywhere behind them as they talk? It's not realistic. It's very abstract, and something like that would be very easy to do in CGI, and even simpler in 2D graphics. But at the same time, when you start getting into complicated things, they're complicated in both worlds, but the CGI, full CGI, to make it blend better is you start getting into money, and I think it boils down to time and money.
It does. Yeah. Now, to answer the question as to stuff that we like that is all CGI, the first Appleseed movie I watched, I thought that was fun. I thought the Astro Boy CGI movie, now granted that was made in Taiwan, but I thought that was well done. It was an accurate Astro Boy story, and it could sort of felt like a Tezuka work. I would say probably my favorite in terms of something that actually spoke to me was Malice Doll, or Malice at Doll, which is a very obscure CGI short work. It's I think about an hour long, written by Jackie Kanaka of Lane, and it was a very early CGI work. This sort of meditation on humans, what makes us human. It's all about androids, sort of a post-human civilization where they're kind of all left without any humans around. And so sort of meditation on what that means and what their purpose is now. It's a very interesting sort of philosophical thing, and it's all done CGI. And it's actually quite intellectually stimulating in its own way. Be aware, it's also very adult in the sense of it has very adult themes. But yeah, it's certainly people have certainly done interesting CGI stuff.
So I'm curious. Are we going to, in 10 years, look back at CGI, early CGI, with the same kind of perspective that we look at early video games? Saying, how many bits were in this system? I can see the pixels on...
Or early hand-drawn animation. I mean, you go back to hand-drawn animation of the 20s, and it was very crude. It was very simple.
And it got the story across.
And even when it was well-crafted in terms of the drawing itself, it was just, a dinosaur walking back and forth. There was not much going on there. And so, to our modern sensibilities, no one would look at that and say, well, that's the future. But hey, there we go. As far as I know, Attack on Titan was very little CGI, but I haven't seen much of it, so I don't know. But I think Attack on Titan was mostly hand-drawn with CGI special effects, as an example there.
I think of this as in the early days of a band, they have a raw energy. And as they refine their craft more and more, they get more skilled, but it's at the expense of some of the crazy raw energy and mistakes that you'll hear in their guitar. Or, it's a trade-off. So there's a certain enjoyment of seeing the development of this.
Yeah.
That I was there when they made the transition to digital.
Yeah, I would love to see those CGI animators be given the freedom, if you will, to really rock that animation. I think it is really hard to do an animation when you have something that is kind of locking you down to make it simpler, make it easier for more shots.
Was it Shirobako that had a great example of this, the struggle between the two styles?
Yeah.
And the executive decisions on how that was made are very interesting if you get a chance to watch that show.
Yeah. And that's all about CGI and what's the future, and do you go into CGI because that might be more popular in the future, but it's folks haven't accepted it yet. That's a tough one. It's very, very complicated. Yeah, and we're seeing CGI for some of the things that aren't people in anime. So dragons in Dragonaut, mecha in a lot of mecha series now are CGI. Knights of Sidonia, as they were mentioning earlier, the mecha are CGI in there, and because that's something that you're basically going to have to learn how to draw for every new production, right? Because that mecha is going to be a unique design and something very, very unusual usually. So it kind of makes sense to model that in CGI. Then you can just sort of render it however you want to, instead of having everyone try to figure out, okay, well, this is kind of circular here, but this offshoot over there.
With CGI becoming more of a framework, I would think that this would lend itself well to production for merchandise. The potential for scaling a 3D model, at least the outer part, the inner workings are always a different portion. But it means that you could have a better reproduction run of a model or of a design and stay truer to the original. And the potential for that is, possibly even 3D printers at some point you could get your own rendering, and who knows, maybe change it around a little bit for your own interests and customize it.
Absolutely. Well, and I think, for the whole production chain, being able to send out that file to, local manufacturers.
Here's our CAD design.
Yeah. Imagine, and I'm sure we're going to see this soon. Even if 3D printing isn't on every single desktop, if there are 3D printers in, every Gunpla model shop, and so you just send out, you go over there and you go through a screen and you say, I want this model of this model kit, and it just starts printing right there.
Now, we've seen something similar like that with books, where you can have a kiosk that will print out an entire book for you,
Oh,
custom
wow.
bind it.
Mm-hmm.
It's just downloaded, printed out really fast,
Mm-hmm.
quick bound, and I think the machine's called the Espresso book machine or something.
Nice.
It's basically a vending machine for books.
Amazing.
And all they have is the raw materials and the data files. So they don't have to carry a huge stockpile of every author's, 3 of every author's stuff. They just have the data and the raw materials, spit it out. And that makes a lot of sense, especially for market penetration, because you can have a small hobby shop in the middle of a rural area that doesn't have to, or in the middle of a city where there's no space to store inventory. All they need is the data file and machines that will keep up with the capacity of the number of people who are coming in to buy them, and they could print it out right there. Zap, zap, zap.
Yeah, I mean, imagine being able to do that for light novels to that point. Being able to say there are 28 light novels in this franchise. We stock all of them. Just walk over here, and we'll send that, and you get a nice, color cover and all the stuff that you're not going to get from just reading it online. There's lots of potential there, and also being able to use those CGI assets in general. Be able to make the video game, the card game, all those things out of those CGI assets much more quickly would be a big advantage. Now, let's not forget, CGI, just having the models doesn't mean you can immediately spit something out. There's always going to be a human involved to render it correctly. Put in the sparkles, put in the effects and all that to model the character correctly.
Unjam the machine.
That's true too. So there will always be artistry involved. It's the question of kind of how do we do that? Interesting question. So so that's kind of the big thing. So would you say that we have a while before CGI makes any sort of major inroads?
Well, with the cost, I think definitely for anime, at least Japanese animation, but with the U.S., there's some pretty
US
pockets.
Yeah, I think the U.S.
They'll
that decision has been made. I think
that.
I think we're going to see CGI. I think if not already, it's taken over.
So how would that come about in Japan?
Well, I think like you were saying before, I think we would need to see a large economic shift in how much money is spent on anime, and thus how much money can be spent on animators, and thus on their tools. If that changes dramatically, then we're gonna see that. And then if we see people buying CGI anime, if that succeeds, then folks are going to invest in it. It's just a question of how that works. And also to that point, we're going to have to find some CGI style, some visual approach. Well, Ruby is a good example of that. RWBY, the recent miniseries, where it is done CGI, but in a very anime style. When we get things that are stylistically remarkable, that are visually intense, it's not just, CGI because it's cheaper. It's CGI because it looks better.
That's the and that made me think of an example of how CGI's kind of come in as the chips and salsa example. So if you think about your first exposure to salsa, it was more of a condiment.
Oh yeah.
But as people enjoyed it more, and there were more varieties and types, and everybody had their own recipe, a little bit more of this or that, it became more of a main part of the people's diet and palate. And now chips are more of a delivery system for the salsa rather than just a condiment that came on there. And so I'm kind of looking at CGI as following that route. We tried a little bit of it in the early days. We're trying a little bit more. And at some point, we're going to want the delivery system. Give me my chips to get my CGI salsa.
A friend of mine talked about this when anime was transitioning to digital on hand-drawn, and the fact that the mistake a lot of studios made was that they would go digital for hand-drawn animation, and so because it was less expensive, they would lower the budget of the series. And he said, no, the answer is you keep the same budget, and thus you can draw more. right? And so once studios started doing that, Gundam Seed's a good example of that, where they added more drawings into there because they could do it more cheaply. And as a result, the animation looked more smooth. There were exceptions. I'm not saying Gundam Seed was the most beautifully animated thing ever, you know, blah, 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 blah. But that was one of the shows that that proved that concept, that you could add in more drawings, and as people watched it more, you know, it drew in more viewers because you were taking advantage of that as opposed to just ignoring it. Now, Liquidus in the chat room points out, you know, video games are an important vector for this.
Very important.
So
I think that's the inroads to Japan, because games lend themselves to that.
And that could be the thing where if we see more video games, and not just like visual novels, but, you know, like action video games and RPG video games as the sources for these things, that could be a big thing where you just import the video game models into your anime, you know, tool chain, and then just start using those and obviously build out from there.
Now that brings up the possibility of a blending of the disciplines.
Yeah.
So video games and anime being less separate and more of subdivisions of a production house.
I mean, you could see it in the .hack franchise, where the whole idea was that you had video games and anime and manga and so forth. They were all part of one big franchise, and where everything was plotted out. So, you know, the anime was a prologue to the video game, and the video game was, you know, the manga was a side story to the video game. So all of these things worked off each other. If you had it more tightly integrated in that way, where, you know, the anime was literally, you know, essentially a cutscene for the video game, same pipeline, then suddenly everything integrates much more smoothly.
That makes sense.
And that could really work very effectively. You know, we'll have to see. It's going to be an interesting future, as so many things are.
Now I wonder how they'll handle chibi.
Oh yes.
Will we find a new style between the more realistic and chibi, and will there be a hybrid?
Good question. Yeah, who knows?
Some new ways of expressing things besides the
And to that point, we're seeing some interesting experimentation in a lot of these weird comedic short CGI anime, where it's just a couple of CGI models. GD fairies, or good fairies, is a good example of that, where it's just little CGI characters just going to wander around and talk. And it's clearly basically they got some voice actors in a room and just had them talk for like 5 minutes, and just recorded that, and then just send that off to animators to animate. And they said, here, you have like $5 in an hour, just get it done. And it's funny. I mean, it's very simple, but it gets across what it needs to. So we're starting to see some of those experimentations of saying, how much do we need to do to get across our story? Who knows? Who knows? The future is hard to decipher.
What I wonder is if the cost of doing CGI in the US will be competitive with anime in Japan, because as our media is taking that path, and Moore's Law is moving in that direction, we'll have developed a base of people who are learning these skills rather than the hand-drawn animation skills.
So you think American animation might get cheaper to the point where it's, you know, on a similar level to anime?
Well, I would like to see that, cost-wise, but as kids grow up, they practice drawing. But now so many kids have technology at their disposal. Unless there's a history of everybody growing up drawing, the incentive is to just go right to the technology. And there's since there's the financial incentive in the US for CGI, and in Japan the cost for animation is lower, there may be a little bit more drive in that direction for those higher paying things. And with the US leading in CGI, the potential for having more people and a more competitive market will mean side jobs, peripheral projects that people might get involved in just to get their foot in the door, thus producing more product supply, and then hopefully demand. Yeah,
that's certainly possible. I think that makes sense. And we could also see that drive demand in each way. We could start seeing more Japanese and Asian CGI animators going to Hollywood and going to America because that's where the CGI jobs are, and more Americans and Europeans going to Japan for the hand-drawn animation because that's where that is.
I would love to see Fooly Cooly
And
done
that-
in 3D.
And I agree. And I think Liquidus, that's a great example. If somebody can do something like Furikuri
That would
in CGI, you know, it's the CGI equivalent of Furikuri, that would I think
be
really
nice.
bust open the CGI market. That would tell people, wow, that's what you can do.
Yeah,
That would amaze folks, I think. Very, very cool.
as a promo for the game.
Yeah, could well be. All right, I think we have covered this pretty darn well. So that is the question of CGI for us. So now the question that we want to answer for next week will be a little different. We're going to talk about which genres anime does best with. So anime seems particularly effective at certain genres of storyline. Which ones do we see most often done well in anime? It's an interesting kind of question. We will see.
Yeah.
So hope you'll tune in for us to us for that next week.
Next Friday.
Next Friday.
Next
Yes,
Friday at
New
9:30
Year's,
Eastern.
9:30 Eastern time. We will be here on YouTube Live. If you want to see more of this kind of stuff, head over to where? What's our website?
www.geekarchaeologist.com.
There we go. Look for that. Look for this there and plenty more. We have lots more shows coming, lots more content coming, more video stuff, anime and otherwise.
And this winter will be an exciting time.
Oh boy. we have many things planned. So thank you all for joining us. We will be back next week. Take care. Have a good time. Dig deeper.
Arigato.
Yes.